The Night the Monster Walked, Part 4. The next morning, I finished my last morning of doing all Tom's chores and my own chores just in time to help Papa and Tom freeze the ice cream for our Sunday dinner. Tom's great brain worked like 60 that day. When he came down from his loft about an hour after dinner, he had a big grin on his face. "Your great brain did it!" I shouted as he came out of the barn and into our corral, where he had been standing guard to see he wasn't disturbed. Tom nodded. "I'm going to convince Parley Benson there are monsters in the cave," he said. "That will make him afraid to meet me there." "How?" I asked, curious as all get out. Tom ignored my question by asking one. "Have you ever seen the footprints of a monster?" "No," I answered. "Has anybody in town ever seen the footprint of a monster?" Tom asked. "I don't see how," I said. "Then nobody knows what the footprint of a monster looks like," Tom said with a grin. "I'm going to make footprints of a monster. Give me your word you won't say anything to Papa or Mama or anybody, and I'll let you help." I sure didn't want to be left out. "I give you my word," I promised. "We'll saddle up Dusty first," Tom said. "If we meet any kids, just tell them we are going for a ride." After we put the saddle and bridle on Dusty, I watched Tom pick up a gunny sack. He mounted the Mustang and rode out of the corral, waiting for me to shut the gate. Then he helped me up behind him. Tom guided the Mustang up and down alleys and in a roundabout way until we were in the back of the slaughterhouse by the stockyard. The odor was terrible, because there were piles of old steer hooves, hides, bones, and skulls. Tom got off Dusty with the gunny sack. He went to the pile of hooves and picked out 3 split-toed ones, which he put in a gunny sack. He didn't say a word until we were back in the barn and had put Dusty back in his stall. "Go to the tool shed and get the saw, a hammer, and some horseshoe nails," he ordered me. When I returned, Tom held the hooves on a bale of hay and sawed off the bone on top so that they would be level. He told me to get a shovel and bury the pieces of bone behind the barn. When I came back, he had a piece of board which was to have been used for kindling wood. He sawed off 2 pieces about 1 foot square. Then he got an old belt of Papa's from his loft and cut off 2 pieces of leather about 6 inches long. "Now, J.D., he said to me, "you go outside and stand guard. Don't let anybody in the barn." I was curious as anything, but did as I was told. I stood outside the barn door where I could hear Tom hammering inside the barn. Finally, he called me to come inside. "Shut the door and stand with your back against it," he said. Then he held up the 2 pieces of board so I could see what he'd done. He nailed 3 of the halves of the steer's hooves to the bottom of each board, with the toes all pointing in different directions. Then he put the boards on the ground. I could see he'd nailed a strap across the top of each board. I stood bug-eyed as Tom stuck the toes of his shoes under the strap. He then walked a few steps and turned around. "Behold, the footprints of a monster," he said. I looked at the footprints he'd made in the dirt. They looked like the tracks of a huge 3-toed animal. Tom began rubbing his hands together. "When I get through, Parley and the other kids will swear there are monsters in Skeleton Cave." Tom took the gunny sack and erased the footprints in the dirt. Then he said triumphantly, "That Bowie knife is as good as mine right now. I'll sneak out after curfew Friday night and make footprints from Skeleton Cave down to the river and back. Saturday morning, all I've got to do is to get Parley and the other kids down by the river so they can see the tracks. If Parley thinks there are monsters in that cave, he'll never meet me Saturday night." "Why would the monster come out of the cave?" I asked. "I'll make them think the monster came down to the river to get a drink of water," Tom answered. I shivered. "Maybe there are real monsters in the cave," I said. "I sure didn't see any," Tom said. "All Uncle Mark and I saw were a lot of bats." "What if Frank and Alan Jensen tell Parley there are nothing but bats in the cave?" I asked, only wanting to help. "I'm going to take care of that right now," Tom said. "I'm going to remind them I saved their lives, and they owe me a favor. I never told you this before, J.D., but Uncle Mark made Frank and Alan and me promise we'd say we'd seen monsters and giant snakes in the cave." Why would he do that? I asked. To scare any kids from ever going exploring in the cave again, Tom answered. You never told me that, I said, feeling cheated. Would I lie to my own brother? Tom asked.